3 million pages of evidence, thousands of unsealed flight logs, millions of data points, names, themes, and timelines connected. You are listening to the Epstein Files, the world's first AI-native investigation into the case that traditional journalism simply could not handle.
Welcome back to the Epstein Files. Last time, we walked through Maxwell arrest. Today, we are following Maxwell trial part 1 through the documentary records, so the timeline, decisions, and institutional failures are clear. As always, every document and source we reference is available at epsteinfiles.fm. So start with prosecution case. That is where the paper trail becomes specific and testable.
It's really the only place to begin. The atmosphere of the trial, all the media coverage, it tended to focus on the personalities, the courtroom sketches.
The spectacle of it all.
Exactly. But the documentary record, the filings, the exhibits, they present a much more clinical sequence of events, a process. And the prosecution's case, it really hinged on a specific strategy. It had to move beyond just general allegations of abuse.
It had to become something more structured.
It had to become a corporate conspiracy. They needed to prove that there was a structure and organization at work here.
So that's our first block of evidence, the prosecution case. We're looking at the indictment itself, United States versus Ghislaine Maxwell, which was filed in the Southern District of New York. This document is, for all intents and purposes, the blueprint for the entire trial.
It is. The indictment, which you can find in the pinpoint database from the U.S. District Court filings, it charges a conspiracy over a very specific decade.
Which is?
1994 to 2004. And that date range is the primary constraint of this whole proceeding.
Why that specific range? What does that do legally?
Well, it effectively bypasses the timeline of the controversial 2008 Florida investigation and that non-prosecution agreement. It focuses the court's attention on the era when Epstein and Maxwell were, for lack of a better term, building the enterprise.
The foundation.
Yes, laying the foundation in Palm Beach, then establishing the hub in New York and expanding their operations to New Mexico and London. It's the startup phase of the conspiracy.
And the indictment itself, it's broken down into a 6-count structure. I think it's important to read the specific charges to really understand the burden of proof the prosecution was facing.
It is. So count 1 was conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts.
The agreement to commit the crime.
Right. Then count 2 is the act itself, enticing minors to travel. Count 3, again, conspiracy to transport minors. And count 4, transporting minors.
So you see the pattern there, the conspiracy, then the act.
Exactly. And it concludes with count 5, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, and count 6, sex trafficking of a minor. The repetition of conspiracy is the key legal lever here.
How so?
Because it allows the prosecution to use what legal analysts referenced in outlets like HuffPost and Courthouse News called the partners in crime strategy.
A partnership, not a hierarchy where one person is just following orders.
Precisely. The goal was to dismantle the defense's expected narrative, which was that Maxwell was merely a subordinate, or maybe even a victim herself. The government's argument, which is all through the filings, was that Maxwell was the essential operational manager.
The COO of the enterprise.
You could frame it that way. The enterprise simply couldn't function without a director managing the logistics, the recruitment, the scheduling.
Now, before we get to the evidence for that, there was a procedural decision made in the pretrial motions that we need to audit. And that's the severing of the perjury counts.
Yes, that's a key tactical point. The original indictment included charges that Maxwell had lied under oath during civil depositions back in 2016.
So years after the conspiracy timeline.
Right. And document EFTA 000000000261 in the pinpoint database shows the court granted the defense's motion to sever those perjury counts, to separate them from this trial.
What's the strategy behind that from the prosecution's perspective? It sounds like they're giving something up.
It seems that way, but it actually streamlined their narrative. It prevented the jury from getting bogged down in the details of a 2016 deposition. It prevented the defense from arguing that the government was just trying to trap Maxwell on a process crime, a technicality.
It keeps the focus tight.
Incredibly tight. It forced the jury to evaluate the evidence of the abuse itself, the grooming, the trafficking that happened between 1994 and 2004. It removed any ambiguity about her later statements and put the focus squarely on the physical movements and actions of the 1990s.
And to establish those physical movements, you need a witness who can verify the logistics, the person who physically moved them.
Which brings us to Larry Visosky, the pilot.
He served as Epstein's pilot for almost 30 years. We're looking at the trial transcripts and the courthouse news coverage here. He flew the Boeing 727.
The one the press called the Lolita Express.
Right. And also the Gulfstream and other aircraft. His testimony is what converts those flight logs from just a spreadsheet of dates and initials into a verified record of transport.
He's the human element that validates the paper trail. He stood in court and identified the passengers. The logs put Maxwell on the plane with the alleged victims, and he confirmed it.
He confirmed the codes they use in the logs too, right?
Yes. GM for Ghislaine Maxwell. JE for Jeffrey Epstein. But more importantly, Visosky identified victims by sight in the courtroom during his testimony.
And that's the link.
That is the corroboration. It's what proves the federal element of the crimes. The transport of minors across state lines. The entire federal jurisdiction hangs on, proving that movement took place.
The trial transcripts also show Visosky placing a number of very high-profile individuals on those flights. We see names like Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew.
Kevin Spacey, Chris Tucker, the violinist, Itzhak Perlman. The names are in the record.
A lot of media attention focused on that list.
It did. But the real forensic value of Visosky's testimony is it's less about the Pasteur manifest and more about the operational security he described on the plane itself.
What did he say about that?
He testified that the cockpit door was always closed during the flight. Always. He stated very explicitly, quote, "I did not see sexual activity in the cabin."
And the defense, of course, jumped on that. A lack of direct evidence.
They did. But if you view it through the lens of an organized criminal enterprise, it demonstrates something else entirely.
Compartmentalization.
Exactly. The flight crew was physically and professionally sealed off from the cabin. This created a completely private, controlled zone where Maxwell and Epstein could operate without witnesses. Visosky's testimony confirmed how frequently Maxwell was on those flights and, crucially, her role in managing the schedule.
So he might operate the machine.
But Maxwell directs the pilot where to go and when. That establishes a management function. She controlled the environment where the transport actually occurred.
So that controlled environment is established. Now we move to what happened inside it. Evidence belonged to the witness testimony. The prosecution builds its case on 4 primary accusers to detail those events.
And we begin with the witness known as Jane.
Why her first?
Jane is the timeline anchor. Based on the courthouse news transcripts, Jane was 14 years old when she first met Epstein and Maxwell. The year was 1994.
So that establishes the start date for the entire conspiracy charge. It begins with her.
It begins with her. And the recruitment location is also significant. It was at the Interlochen Center for the Arts.
A place where talented young people would be.
A place consistent with a pattern of targeting environments where ambitious and perhaps vulnerable young people congregate. But Jane's testimony provides a very specific description of Maxwell's role in the hierarchy. She was not described as a passive observer.
What was her description?
Jane's words were, "She was the lady of the house."
That phrase, it comes up again and again in the documents.
It does. It denotes authority, control. Jane testified that Maxwell was present during the abuse. This is critical. It places her inside the room. It dismantles any potential argument of ignorance.
She couldn't claim she didn't know what was happening down the hall.
Not according to this testimony. And here's where we see the documents start to connect. We can cross-reference this with the first evidence block. Visosky's flight logs corroborate the travel dates that Jane described. Jane testified she was flown to Palm Beach.
And the logs show a flight on that date.
A flight with her, Epstein, and Maxwell listed as passengers, confirmed by the pilot. The documents align. The witness account is verified by the physical record.
The second witness, Kate, changes the location. This moves the operation's scope outside the U.S.
To London. Kate was a British model, and her testimony really illustrates what the prosecution called the buffer strategy.
Explain that. What's the buffer?
Kate testified that she was introduced to Maxwell first, not to Epstein. Maxwell presented herself as this sophisticated, well-connected socialite. It's a method to lower the defenses of a potential victim.
The introduction comes from a peer or someone you might look up to.
Someone who seems safe, a mentor figure. The threat assessment is immediately reduced.
And Kate's testimony also details the normalization of the massage requirement.
Yes, the massage euphemism. It's the standard entry point described in almost all the testimony. Kate stated that Maxwell framed the request as something completely non-sexual.
Just a medical necessity.
For Epstein's bad back. It was presented as a chore almost, a favor. Kate also testified to a specific assault that happened at Epstein's home in London. And again, crucially, she placed Maxwell in the room while it was happening.
So a consistent pattern. Presence during the act.
It's a core component of the prosecution's case against her.
The third witness, Carolyn, brings the focus back to Palm Beach and provides data on the financial structure of the grooming process.
Carolyn was also 14 years old at the time. She testified to receiving cash payments for her visits.
How much?
$300 in cash. Now, you have to put that in the context of the mid-1990s. For a 14-year-old, that amount of cash creates an immediate and powerful financial dependence.
Who was giving her the money?
Carolyn testified that Maxwell would sometimes schedule the appointments and would also handle the money. She would physically hand her the cash.
That's a critical audit point.
It is, because handling the disbursements implies direct knowledge of the service being compensated. You don't act as the paymaster for a transaction you were unaware of. It connects her directly to the financial mechanics of the operation.
And Carolyn used a specific term to describe Maxwell, didn't she?
She did. She called her the godmother.
The godmother.
It indicates the psychological manipulation that was at play. Maxwell wasn't just an employer or a scheduler. She acted as a maternal figure, a mentor. She gave gifts, advice.
That's classic grooming.
It is. It creates a kind of emotional debt. It makes it incredibly difficult for the victim to recognize the abuse for what it is, because the abuser is also positioned as a benefactor, a protector.
And the fourth key witness in this block is Johanna Sjoberg. For this, we're referencing her deposition from the U.S. District Court archives.
Sjoberg's testimony is what connects the core operation to some of those high-profile names we saw in the flight logs. Specifically, she describes an incident at Epstein's New York mansion in 2001, an incident involving Prince Andrew.
The incident with the puppet.
Yes. Sjoberg testified that Prince Andrew used a puppet to grope her breast while they were posing for a photograph. But for the purposes of the Maxwell trial, the most relevant fact is Maxwell's proximity and role.
She was there.
Sjoberg placed Maxwell in the room, facilitating the entire interaction. She organized the photograph. She was directing the scene. And again, we see the recruitment pattern. Sjoberg wasn't a model or an actress. She was recruited while working at a college library. It shows how broad the targeting really was.
So we have the pilot's logs showing the transport, the victim testimony describing the abuse and Maxwell's direct involvement, and the records of financial disbursements.
Yeah.
Now, Evidence Block 3 establishes the written protocols for how this whole environment was managed.
Government Exhibit 606, the Jeffrey Epstein Household Manual.
This document is just remarkable.
It's the operational handbook for the conspiracy. It's not a simple guide to housekeeping. It is a document of control, a document of operational security.
The most quoted line from it is the instruction to staff to see nothing, say nothing.
And that is an explicit written instruction. It establishes a formal code of silence, but it goes much deeper. The manual details specific protocols for when guests are present.
Rules about what?
Rules prohibiting eye contact with certain guests. Extremely specific cleaning protocols to be followed immediately after the massages. It even lists what items need to be stocked and where. Things like baby oil and extra towels.
What does a document like this prove about Maxwell's role?
It proves she was the author of the environment. The manual explicitly designates Maxwell as the lady of the house. It grants her direct authority over hiring, firing, and all daily operations. This isn't a casual girlfriend. This is the manager of the enterprise.
The level of detail about the massages is key.
It is. The specificity of those instructions. It suggests a standardized, repeatable process that she personally oversaw and enforced.
And in addition to the manual, we also have the infamous Little Black Book and other contact lists that were entered into evidence.
Right. And the contact lists, they demonstrate the sheer scope of the network, the volume of high-level contacts. We're talking politicians, scientists, royalty. It functioned as what the prosecution called a power trap.
How so? A power trap.
The network itself was used as a tool of intimidation. It created the impression for victims that Epstein and Maxwell were untouchable, that they were connected to everyone, that there was no one you could possibly report this to who wasn't in their circle.
And finally, in this block, the financial records, the paper trail.
The records presented at trial showed millions of dollars being transferred directly from Epstein to Maxwell over the years. We're looking at the trial financial exhibits in the Pinpoint database.
And how did the prosecution frame these payments?
They characterized them as a retainer. Essentially, a salary for her role in procuring victims and managing the entire household operation. It wasn't just lifestyle support. The regularity and size of the payments aligned perfectly with the timeline of the conspiracy charges. It was compensation for services rendered.
Okay, let's take all of these documents and reconstruct the timeline. That's our evidence block 4.
The timeline really resolves into 3 distinct phases. First, you have the early years, let's say 1994 to 1997.
This is centered in Florida.
It's almost exclusively a Palm Beach operation at this point. We have the testimony of Jane and Carolyn, which places everything in Florida. And we have later documents, like the Ryder letter, that confirm the police focus was there. This is the period where Maxwell arrives and immediately integrates into the household management. The dating of the household manual puts her in charge from very early on.
Yeah, then comes the second phase, the expansion.
Right. Roughly 1998 to 2005. The operation metastasizes, it expands to New York, and the Zorro Ranch in New Mexico starts appearing frequently in the flight logs.
And the recruitment method changes.
It evolves. It becomes what has been described as a recruitment pyramid. You see victims like Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who alleged they were coerced into recruiting other young women. Her memoir, The Billionaire's Playboy Club, and various court filings, they detail this escalation of the enterprise.
And that brings us to the third phase, which is really more of a gap.
2008 gap. Yes. This is a critical institutional marker. The Maxwell trial in New York, the one we're discussing, it was forced to focus on that 1994-2004 window.
Why?
Because of what happened in the 2008 Florida investigation. The outcome of that case dictated the constraints of this one.
Which leads us directly into evidence block 5, institutional decisions. The documents here, they show the systemic failures. The points where the system could have acted but didn't. We have to start with the Ryder letter.
The Ryder letter is damning. The source is the town of Palm Beach Police Department. It's a letter from Police Chief Michael S. Ryder to the state attorney, Barry E. Krischer, dated May 1st, 2006.
And what does it say?
Ryder writes, and this is a direct quote, "I continue to find your office's treatment of these cases highly unusual."
From a police chief to a state attorney, that's a formal declaration of conflict.
Yeah. It's a formal declaration of obstruction. Ryder's letter makes it clear that his department, local law enforcement, had established probable cause. They had evidence, they had witnesses, and they intended to prosecute Epstein and others in state court. The letter documents that the state attorney's office actively blocked those efforts.
And the result of that blockage, that decision by Krischer's office, was that the case was kicked up to the federal level.
Which led directly to the non-prosecution agreement, the NPA.
The document that shaped everything that came after.
Everything. The source is the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. This document contains the immunity clause. And that clause granted immunity not just to Jeffrey Epstein,
but to any potential co-conspirators.
That phrase, those 4 words, that is the legal shield that protected Ghislaine Maxwell. It's the reason she was not prosecuted in 2008. Despite all the evidence the Palm Beach police had gathered, this federal agreement immunized the entire network of associates.
And it took years of legal battles to get around that.
Over a decade. You can look at Document Cloud Source 6413858 to see the details of the legal fights required just to challenge the validity of that agreement, which is what finally allowed federal prosecutors in New York to bring charges against Maxwell in 2020.
There are also the FBI's own documents from that period. The Phase I documents.
Yes, from the FBI vault. These documents confirm the FBI was conducting surveillance. They were collecting evidence hard drives. Tapes are mentioned in the Epstein Files source during that 2006 to 2008 period.
So they knew. They were investigating.
They were. And the lack of charges against any of the associates, despite this collection of evidence, represents a documented, conscious, institutional decision to halt the investigation at Epstein.
So the trial record is built. But Evidence Block 6 covers what's missing, the unresolved gaps. The trial leaves several major areas completely opaque.
The client list is the primary gap. And here we have to be very precise. We need to distinguish between the flight logs, which are proven, admitted evidence,
and the speculative idea of a client list.
Exactly. What we do have are the sealed names in the civil suits. In the Ghislaine versus Maxwell case, for instance, numerous individuals are identified only as John Doe. Those names were not unsealed as part of this criminal trial.
So the full network remains officially unknown. Then there are the missing tapes.
Correct. The Epstein Files source references the seizure of a massive number of hard drives and videos from the New York townhouse during the FBI raid in 2019.
Where are they?
That's the question. Those materials were not fully introduced into the public record of the Maxwell trial. Their content, their current status, it all remains unverified in the public domain.
And they're the other partners. The recruiters beyond Maxwell, the most prominent being Jean-Luc Brunel.
Brunel. The source for his connection is pinpoint database document EFTA 0000215553.pdf. He was a French modeling scout. Allegations claimed he played a key role in the European recruitment pipeline, feeding young women into the operation.
But he never stood trial.
He died by suicide in a Paris prison before he could be tried. His death closes the judicial record on his specific involvement, leaving another major gap in the story. It's a pattern. Epstein, Brunel. Key figures who never face a final verdict.
So if we synthesize all these records, the prosecution's case, the witness testimony, the institutional decisions, what's the final picture?
The documents establish a clear pattern of protection. You have the Ryder letter, which proves that local law enforcement identified the crime and wanted to act.
But they were stopped.
They were stopped. Then you have the household manual, which proves that Maxwell wasn't a bystander. She was actively managing the criminal environment. And finally, you have the non-prosecution agreement, which proves that the legal system itself provided the shield that allowed the enterprise to continue for another 12 years.
And Maxwell's role in all this was to be the buffer.
She was the ultimate buffer. She buffered Epstein from the victims by normalizing the abuse, by acting as the friendly face. She buffered him from the staff by creating and enforcing the manual's code of silence. And the legal system, through the NPA, in turn buffered the entire enterprise from accountability.
So the documents make the theory that Epstein was just a lone wolf.
Incompatible with the evidence. The level of managed logistics, the schedules, the payments, the written protocols, it's all documented. It required a manager.
So just summarize, we have the flight logs proving transport, we have the manual proving management, we have the victim testimony proving abuse and complicity, and we have the Ryder letter proving a local effort to prosecute was thwarted.
And what we don't have is the full client list. We don't have the content of the seized tapes. The documentation gives us the mechanism of the conspiracy, but the full scope of the network remains partially obscured. It's obscured by sealed court records and the pretrial deaths of key figures in the organization.
Next time, Maxwell Trial Part 2.
You have just heard an analysis of the official record. Every claim, name and date mentioned in this episode is backed by primary source documents. You can view the original files for yourself at epsteinfiles.fm. If you value this data-first approach to journalism, please leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening right now. It helps keep this investigation visible. We'll see you in the next file.